Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC. My guest today is Brian Riedl. Brian's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he studies budget, tax, and economic policy. Previously, he was chief economist for Senator Rob Portman and staff director of the Senate Finance Subcommittee on Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Growth. He's also been an economic policy advisor to the presidential campaigns of Marco Rubio and Mitt Romney. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website in the near future. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Brian Riedl, welcome to The Prescription.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Howard.
Good to see you. So President Biden belatedly kicked off what's likely to be a long and contentious budget season when he released his 2024 fiscal agenda last week. For the coming fiscal year, he'd spend about $6.9 trillion. He'd raise about $5 trillion in new revenues, and he'd borrow the rest. Over the next decade, he'd spend about $82 trillion, hard to get my arms around that number, raise about $65 trillion, and add about $17 trillion to the national debt. As enormous as those numbers are, Biden says he'd lower the cumulative deficit by about $3 trillion off of the baseline. So before we get into details, does the Biden budget represent top-line progress towards fiscal restraint?
Howard, I don't think it represents much progress. The president has already added $5 trillion in new initiatives over the past 2 years. So even the $3 trillion really doesn't even balance out just what we've seen over the past 2 years. When we're facing $20 trillion in baseline deficits over 10 years, which is really an almost unfathomable figure, reducing it from 20 trillion to 17 trillion is just not enough. You still end up with a debt that's growing dramatically over the next 10 years. Another problem with it is I'm very concerned that while the president raises $5 trillion in new taxes primarily on the rich, $2 trillion of that goes into new spending rather than deficit reduction. And the reason that's really scary is there's really only a limited amount of tax the rich revenues available to close a deficit this big. And if you start to project out the 10-year numbers, you realize we're going to need all of the tax the rich revenues that we're going to raise just to address the deficit so that we don't have to dump as much of it on the middle class. But the more of those revenues you pull into new spending, the bigger the leftover deficit is for the middle class. So I'm worried that if anything, enacting the president's budget might actually increase the portion of the deficit that's going to eventually have to be financed by the middle class because we've pushed so many of the tax the rich revenues into new spending. I would have liked to have seen the tax increases balanced out by spending cuts so that you have a balanced approach to the deficit.
So let's take a look at some of the details of the budget. So on the revenue side, he's proposing, as he has in the past, big tax increases on high-income households and corporations, coupled with an expanded child tax credit and expanded earned income tax credit. On the spending side, he'd reduce Medicare drug costs by enhancing the program's ability to negotiate prices. He'd increase funding for programs such as childcare, universal preschool, and Medicaid home and community-based long-term care. So when you look at the details of it, where is he going wrong?
I think, again, first, I think he's probably maxing out, if not beyond maxing out, some of the tax increases on corporations and investors. If you just want to compare to the OECD average, which I think is a lot of countries in Europe that are more liberal than us and some other countries around the world, he would push the top corporate rate 10 points higher than the OECD average. He would push the top tax rate on capital gains 30 points higher than the OECD average. Both of those figures are according to the Tax Foundation. Individual income tax revenues would also be above the OECD average. It's not to say that we can't go above the OECD average, but when you're going 10 to 30 points higher, there's probably a reason other countries don't tax that high. There's a reason they don't, the capital gains tax rate in the OECD is about 20 points and it would go to nearly 50. So I do think, again, he's kind of maxing out, if not even more than maxing out, on the upper income tax hikes. And again, the issue is not that we should feel bad for corporations or wealthy people. It's that much of the OECD learned the hard way that that there's only so much you can raise, and there's also a certain degree of economic damage. So I think he's probably a little over relying on tax hikes for the rich. But again, I also think if there's a case to be made for a lot of these new spending initiatives, I would rather they be offset with more spending savings rather than pushing spending up to 25.7% of GDP over the next 10 years. That would be the highest sustained spending level in American history outside of World War II and the pandemic. And so I worry that you're maximizing taxes for a certain degree of the population and the economy, but you're still not really doing enough on the deficit. So I think there just has to be more done on the spending side. I would have loved to have seen the president take on Social Security and Medicare because that's driving deficits. I know the politics that nobody wants to touch it right now, but really, you're not going to fix the deficit until you address those.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But let me ask you again about some of the areas where you'd be spending money. So childcare, universal preschool, Medicaid, home and community-based care, or the expanded child credit, which of course is a tax cut, or at least most of it is. Are any of those beneficial? Are those worthwhile doing if they were paid for?
If they're paid for, I think expanding the earned income tax credit is really important. We've had a big problem with declining labor force participation. The EITC, especially for childless adults, is too low. The American Action Forum did a study a couple of years ago that estimated that improving the EITC alone could add up to 8 million people to the workforce, which is a really huge number. I think childcare is clearly a huge issue for a lot of people that something has to be done about. I have 2 kids. I live in the Washington, D.C. area where childcare is a second mortgage. I'm not sure the president's proposals necessarily are well thought out on childcare, but the idea of addressing childcare, addressing the EITC are great, as long as you can make room in the budget, set priorities, and make trade-offs, and not just add it to the deficit.
So there's been a lot of discussion, actually on both sides of the aisle, about doing something with the child tax credit. Your former boss, Mitt Romney, actually has come up with an interesting proposal. Do you think there's some room to work out a deal on
I would love to see a deal on the child tax credit. I think that there is some bipartisan interest in it. I like what Senator Romney said, which is he said there's a way to expand the child credit that doesn't necessarily blow up the deficit. Basically, if you expand the child credit, at a certain point, it becomes duplicative with some of the parts of the EITC. The fact that the EITC gives you more money for more kids. He would say, let's pull back some of the duplication in other programs, pay for it with other changes, and then you can somewhat minimize the cost. Now, I just said we should increase the EITC, and I still think we should do, especially for childless adults. But the aspect of it where the more money you get for the EITC based on more kids, that becomes less necessary if you're already giving people a bigger child credit for more kids. And so I think there is probably a deal to be made paying for much of it with duplicative savings and other programs at that point, if Congress is willing to actually sit down and have the 2 parties talk to each other, which I know, seems impossible today.
Right, for sure. So you mentioned Medicare, and Biden actually has a Medicare proposal. He's got a few, but the one that's most interesting to me is he says he would add 20 years to the solvency of Medicare Part A hospital insurance by increasing the tax rate and broadening the base on the 2010 net investment income tax, and allocating all its revenues to the HI trust fund. Good idea? Bad idea? What do you think?
I think this is a legitimate tax. I mean, people kind of dismiss it and say, oh, again, this is just a tax for the rich. Who cares? But again, when you're getting up to a 5% tax surtax, that is pushing up the top marginal rate to a point that does make it harder to do things like eliminate the FICA cap on Social Security and shore up Social Security. So this is real money for corporate, and it would be extended to small business income or pass-through income, which sometimes aren't small, but it would be extended to pass-through income as well. That is a real tax hike that is real money. Now, I do think Medicare requires additional resources, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. but also the fact that the president would also simply take existing net income investment income tax money and transfer it into the Medicare trust fund. That's not actually saving Washington money. That's just taking money from the general fund and putting it into the Medicare trust fund. So the overall fiscal deficit and fiscal gap for the government doesn't change. You're just moving money in between funds. And a related note on that is, the president says, well, this will shore up Medicare for 30 years. Medicare Part A is the part being affected here, but Medicare Part B and D, which aren't funded by the payroll tax and they're more funded by premiums, that's an even bigger deficit driver. Those costs are growing out of control, and the president really isn't doing much on Medicare Part B and D. So I do think he kind of overstates it when he suggests, well, we've solved Medicare for 30 years. You're kind of playing a shell game with money, and B, you're still leaving out B and D costs, which are actually a much bigger long-term cost hike than Medicare Part A.
Yeah, and
there's a lot more to do.
And for people who are not Medicare geeks, Part B is physician care and other care, and Part D is the drug benefit. And actually, 3/4 of that is paid for through the general fund.
Right. There's kind of a perception out there that, I pay my Medicare through premiums and payroll taxes. Your payroll tax only funds Medicare Part A, which is hospitals. Medicare Part B and D, they're not pre-funded with payroll taxes. Your premium pays up 25%, at least, except for the super rich pay a little bit more. And the taxpayers pay the other 75%. Which is sustainable until you have 74 million baby boomers retiring into that system. And if you just take a look at Medicare over the next 30 years, the gap between Medicare's incoming trust fund money, payroll taxes, premiums, and spending is $80 trillion over 30 years. Medicare is going to take in 23 trillion and spend 103 trillion. Including the interest costs that result from those shortfalls. So that's an $80 trillion hole that has to be addressed. This is the main driver of long-term deficits. I would love to see the president address that, or at least even the Republicans address it and have the two parties sit down.
So the one proposal, I guess, the substantive proposal he's got to reduce Medicare costs is expanding and accelerating the negotiation of Medicare drug prices. Is that a good idea? Does that make sense?
I think it's a trade-off. It's not a free lunch. People kind of say, oh, well, we should pay less like other countries pay. A lot of the reason we pay a little bit more money is because a lot of it goes into drug research and drug development, and we lead the world in that. In fact, other countries that spend less on prescription drugs are essentially free riding in a lot of ways off our innovation. The Congressional Budget Office has said that the more we put on some of these price controls, you're going to get less innovation, you're going to get fewer new drugs coming to the market. That's a trade-off we have to take as a country. I'm not really taking a position on whether it's a good or bad trade-off. I think reducing drug costs is a top priority. Innovation is also a top priority, and we have to find a way to trade that off. Perhaps there's ways to increase government funding of innovation through a separate fund, so it's not being paid by the seniors who actually, or the younger people who need the drugs. But we have to find a way to square the circle of lowering drug costs while still protecting innovation.
I always thought that since NIH is funding a lot of drug research, that it might be an interesting idea if the government got an equity stake in some of these drug companies that are taking advantage of that money.
Perhaps there's a lot of creative ways to fund drug innovation without necessarily having the diabetic pay for it through higher insulin prices. But the money has to be spent. Unfortunately, we've all heard the numbers of how it costs, $1 billion or $2 billion to bring a new drug from idea to market. And that has to be paid for somewhere in the economy. We need to protect innovation, especially with the rest of the world not providing as much medical drug innovation.
So the other big issue, of course, as you mentioned, is Social Security.
Yeah.
It's been interesting to watch the debate. A few Republicans stuck their heads up out of the foxhole and said we would actually like to do something about Social Security benefits. Biden predicted right off, chopped their heads off, and It's now interesting because most of the Republican leadership has said Medicare and Social Security are off the table, but you still have some Republicans, including some moderate Republicans, people like Nancy Mace and some others, who say we still want to talk about this. So where does this go?
Well, just from an economic standpoint, we don't have a choice as a country. I mentioned Medicare's $80 trillion shortfall. Social Security has a $36 trillion shortfall, cash shortfall over the next 30 years. So that's $116 trillion in shortfalls over the next 30 years for those two programs. The rest of the budget's actually balanced over 30 years. It's $116 trillion in Social Security and Medicare. And when people say, well, that's a long-term concern, those shortfalls were $400 billion last year. They're going to rise to $2 trillion a decade from now. The reason deficits are going to $2 trillion a decade from now is because $400 billion a year to $2 trillion a year, and then it keeps rising. We as a country have to address this. We don't have a choice. We either have to address Social Security and Medicare or commit to significantly raising middle-class taxes, taxing the rich, cutting defense, cutting waste, cutting Ukraine, Medicare for all. They can be small pieces of the puzzle, but not much more. And so I get frustrated when I hear Democrats and Republicans say, we're not going to talk about this. We're not going to talk about this. That's fine if you don't want to talk about it, but the economy at a certain point is going to force you to talk about it, because where's that $116 trillion going to come from? Do we assume that the bond market is going to lend $116 trillion at low interest rates for the next 30 years? Maybe, maybe not. And so I think I'm very cynical lately about this. I think it took some courage for some Republicans to say we need to talk about this. I'm very frustrated. President Biden, I believe, demagogued the issue. And now Republicans are running screaming. Former President Trump is attacking Republicans on this. And I think in 10 or 20 years, we're going to look back and say, what a missed opportunity when we're dealing with the consequences of not addressing these issues.
So it's interesting. Just this morning, Emmanuel Macron in France, with executive order, decided to raise the retirement age there. Now, their increase is only from 62 to 64, so we're already at 67. So a little different situation. Nonetheless, in spite of massive protests, massive strikes, lack of support apparently in their equivalent of the House of Representatives, he's doing it anyway. So is there a lesson for us to learn there about a politician who's willing to put it on the line and say we're going to do something about this? Yeah,
and this is what's scary right now is it's not the politicians who I would say are not acting with much courage on these issues. They're following the public. Even Republican voters don't want to touch Social Security and Medicare. But again, if that's the case, you're probably committing to huge middle-class tax hikes down the road. Now, we don't have a president. We don't have the power for a president to just do it by executive order. But I think the way to do this, I think it has to be done bipartisan. If one party tries to do this by themselves, they're going to get pummeled to such a degree. And not only that, but the other party will probably dominate the next election and then on the first day repeal it. Most big, 1983 Social Security, both parties did it together. And I think both parties have to do this together. My fear is that it's not going to happen until we start to really feel the economic pain, that essentially the bond market might slow down, the economy might slow down, interest rates might rise, markets might start to panic. And the thing that scares me is at that point, reform is going to be so much more expensive. I would rather do reforms gradually now that can also probably protect the bottom half of seniors, rather than have to do more drastic spending reforms or tax hikes later because we waited too long. But the thing that keeps me up at night is I don't know how to get people focused on this and make the politics work for it. People are just burying their heads in the sand, and I worry they're going to continue until the economy bites back or the bond market bites back.
A recent guest who would certainly identify herself as a progressive said what she would do is actually have a public referendum and give people a choice of, do you want to raise taxes? Do you want to reduce benefits? or do you want to have a 22% automatic benefit reduction in 10 years? Which do you want to do? And she thought that might give politicians cover to actually do something.
I would love that. I think you need, one of the things I think is some sort of constraint that says, look, we can't borrow 116 trillion. Therefore, our options are these tax policies, these entitlement or Social Security and Medicare changes, or somewhere in the middle with a combination of a more modest version of each. You know, I would rather people do that and then choose, even if they don't choose where I would go on that spectrum. The fact that we'd at least be making a choice, I think, would ultimately make whatever we choose less painful. I would love the situation where people have to choose as long as they're willing to make a choice and not just keep kicking the can down the road, because then we all lose. The middle class numbers, I mean, I ran the numbers on this. If we were to pay for Social Security and Medicare without raising or without any reforms, you have a fiscal gap that grows to 6% of GDP over 30 years. To close a 6% of GDP gap, you would need to raise the payroll tax by 9 points. That'll get you 3% of GDP. And then do a 20% VAT for the other 3% of GDP. Those numbers are according to CBO. That's a really big tax burden. And if we're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare, that's kind of what we're endorsing.
That's an interesting issue, Brian. I'd like to ask you about that. You know, there's a real argument to be made that the income tax is pretty much played out, given the tax base that we continue to narrow, given the politics. You know, have we reached a point where if we do need more revenue, it's going to have to come from something else like a consumption tax?
Absolutely. Marginal tax rates. I mean, the income tax is generally brought in usually between 7 and 9% of GDP. Last year, it spiked to 10. You're not going to get it up to 13, 14, 15% of GDP, especially when marginal tax rates in some states are already going to be kind of heading north of 50 if you include all the tax rates. You can only really go up to, let's say, 60 to 70% before you actually start reducing revenue. And even then, the revenue really starts to trickle and the economic situation gets worse. There's just not that much more juice to be squeezed from the income tax, which means you have to start looking at things like consumption taxes, value-added taxes. This is how Europe funds their systems. They max out on payroll taxes, which combines with your income to tax wages. And then they get most of the rest of it through value-added taxes. And ultimately, I think that's where we probably end up if we don't actually address the spending side. You probably end up with a consumption tax. I know there's also a lot of talk about wealth taxes. I think some of the wealth tax estimates and proposals are kind of pie in the sky. I don't think you're going to get nearly that much money from a wealth tax, even if it's constitutional. So I think really, maybe some sin taxes, maybe carbon taxes can do a little bit, but really I think, a pure VAT is probably where you end up.
So let's go from looking in the long range to looking very short term. Mm-hmm. So one of the issues that we're going to confront very soon, probably in the spring, is the debt limit. And many Republicans say they will not vote to extend the debt limit unless the White House agrees to substantial spending reductions. Should the debt limit get tied up in the spending debate?
I think I've written on this extensively, had an op-ed in the Boston Globe on this. I think the first thing Republicans should do is say, we're going to raise the debt limit, period. This is a hostage you cannot shoot. It would be economically calamitous. We cannot cut spending 20% in one day to balance the budget. You'd be defaulting on millions of businesses that do business with the federal government. You'd be causing bankruptcies for businesses. You'd be defrauding businesses. You'd be causing chaos. I think first off, we need to commit that we will raise a debt limit. That being said, Democrats used to sit down during debt limit debates and voluntarily negotiate deals. The reason we didn't have debt limit wars like this in the 80s and 90s is because we didn't need to. The 8 biggest deficit reduction laws since 1985 were all attached to debt limit. And there's some debate about whether the debt limit was the part added at the end or whether it was beginning. But the point is, when we would raise the debt limit back then, we would sit down and negotiate. And I think Republicans need to commit that the debt limit will be raised no matter what. but Democrats should agree that yes, you pay the bills, but we should also take the opportunity to sit down and reform the deficit at the same time. And I think it's disappointing that they're not doing so.
So Republicans have yet to come up with their own proposal.
Mhm.
They're extremely critical of the Biden budget,
Yeah.
but there's no Republican proposal yet. First of all, do you think we'll see one? And second of all, given their own self-imposed constraints, no cuts in Medicare, no cuts in Social Security, no cuts in defense, no cuts in veterans benefits, no tax increases, how do they get to any significant deficit reduction?
Well, I think for the debt limit, there's two strands of negotiations. There's two tiers. There's a debt limit, and then there's the 10-year deficit reduction. I think on the debt limit, Republicans are realizing they're going to have to be more modest. You're not going to totally turn the deficit around here. I think they're going to look for symbolic things. What the Freedom Caucus put out, I think, was I admire their eagerness, but I think some of the stuff that they're proposing is a little absurd. Basically cutting in half non-defense discretionary spending as a share of the economy over 10 years, I think is probably not very realistic. But I do think that there are modest reforms you can do on the debt limit. In terms of just the broader negotiations over the 10-year deficit, when I hear Republicans say we're going to balance the budget, but we're going to extend the tax cuts, and we're not going to touch Social Security, Medicare, defense, and veterans. Well, the CBO just put out a report that said you would have to eliminate 100% of everything else, and you'd still be 20 billion short. Like, we're not going to eliminate Medicaid and food stamps. We're not going to eliminate education spending, highway spending. It's the absurdities, I think, are out there. I think Republicans should be more realistic about the target. We're not going to balance the budget in 10 years, but we can perhaps stabilize the debt at 95% of GDP. And I think realistically, you have to put everything on the table. You're not going to do this out of 1/6 of the budget.
So I have to ask you, does cutting woke spending, what does that even mean? And would it have a material effect on the budget deficit?
Yeah, former Trump budget director Russ Vought put out a report that said we can balance the budget by cutting woke spending. And what he essentially does is just put the word woke in front of every government program except Social Security and Medicare and defense and veterans. He says NASA's woke, food stamps are woke, Medicaid is woke. I mean, I think this is actually, as a budget economist, I actually find this insulting to my intelligence. I wouldn't say that I'm the most woke person around, but there is not a line item in the federal budget called woke. So no, you're going to have, there's no get out of jail free card here with woke spending. You got it. But the broader concern here is Republicans are still under somewhat of a delusion that we can dramatically cut spending without cutting anything popular. And if they can't find anything unpopular, maybe they can rebrand Medicaid, food stamps, disability, student loans as unpopular. That's not going to work. We're going to have to put everything on the table. Yes, everything is going to be unpopular. We just need to get both parties together to accept that and do something unpopular together, so that perhaps it has more legitimacy for voters.
So Brian, we have just about a minute left, and I have to ask you, you and I have both written for years about the interest rate risks of high deficits.
Oh boy.
And we've been wrong year after year after year. So is it possible that we'll just continue to be wrong and somehow the government will be able to borrow these massive amounts of money and get away with it?
I wrote a big report on this 1.5 years ago, and I determined that, first off, interest rates are starting to rise now. Yeah. Essentially, the federal numbers are sustainable really only if the interest rate paid by the government stays below 4% forever. And even then, you still eventually get to the scary numbers, but it takes an extra 20 years or so. Really, you want it to stay under 3% to really make it out 50, 60, 70 years. I think it's just very dangerous to gamble on interest rates never rising above 3 or 4% ever again. Right, the 10-year bond right now is at 4%, and the federal borrowing usually almost tracks the 10-year bond a little bit lower. I think they're already starting to rise at interest rates as well. But the thing is, if you borrow this much money, again, you don't even need high interest rates. Even 3 to 4% get you in trouble. And I just think it's so dangerous to gamble our entire fiscal future on the hope that interest rates never exceed 3 or 4% ever again. Because while I can't predict the future of interest rates, one thing I can say is that the economy is unpredictable and economic variables tend to fluctuate. Sometimes they go down, but sometimes they go up. And anyone who says they'll never rise again, I'll take the other side of that bet.
Hey, Brian, we are out of time. It's a pleasure to talk to you as always. On that optimistic note, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to our audience.
Thank everyone.